Today's daf yomi is Kiddushin Samach Zayin. We're going to start on the bottom of Samach Vav Beis, broadcasting to you from Zaria. We thank our hosts very generously for allowing us to teach a daf yomi in their house. So we're going to start on the bottom of Kiddushin Samach Vav Beis at the Mishnah. At the Mishnah, around 10 lines on the bottom. So the Mishnah, we're going to move to a different part of the Masechta. The Masechta takes up a new theme, and now we're going to start talking about yichus, about lineage, yuchsin, about who's allowed to marry whom. So the Mishnah says, Kol makom sheyesh Kiddushin ve'ein avera, anytime where there's a relationship, and if the man would try to betroth the woman, it would take effect. Rashi says, Shah Kiddushin toksimba, the Kiddushin would take effect. Ve'ein avera, and this relationship is not prohibited, meaning the Torah does not prohibit the relationship. Then we're going to say, under those circumstances, havlad holech achar zachar, that the offspring, the lineage is we're going to assume that the lineage is going to be considered follows the father. So if the Kiddushin takes effect and it's not an Avera, we're going to say that the Vlad, the offspring, follows the male. The Ezozo, what's an example of this? And this refers to Kohanes Levi Yisrael. If you have a girl who she's the daughter of a Kohen or Levi or Yisrael, Shenasu a Kohen Levi Yisrael, she marries a Kohen or Levi or Yisrael, then we're going to say that the offspring follows the father, and the offspring is a Kohen, Levi, or Yisrael. So the Gemara doesn't tell us why, but that's the assumption of the Mishnah. And Rashi says, Levi shenasa kohenes or Yisraelis, but no Levi. If there's a Levi who marries a female whose father was a Levi or a Yisraelis, or a Kohen who marries a Levi or Yisraelis, the offspring is a Kohen. Yisrael shenasa kohanes, but if it's a Yisrael who marries a kohanes, then the Vlad and the offspring is the Yisrael. Because it says, Rashi gives us a hint because he knows that we are curious. Why? And he says, based upon the pasuk, that the pasuk says, "L'mishpechosam u'beis avosam." It says, according to their families, to their father's home. So that's the first concept of the Mishnah. Then we have the second concept of the Mishnah, Kol makom sheyesh Kiddushin, where the Kiddushin is tofes, and that meaning to say the Kiddushin takes effect, v'yesh avera, but even though it takes effect, there's a sin involved. I mean to say it's a prohibition from the Torah. It's not like Rabbi Akiva who says anytime there's a prohibition, the Kiddushin doesn't take effect. Here we're saying the Kiddushin does take effect, but it's a sin involved. Then Avlad holech achar pogum, and the offspring follows the one who is a pogum, the one who's defective. And what's the example here? Ve'ezozo zo almano a kohen gadol. Like for example, a widow to a kohen gadol. Now a kohen gadol is not allowed to marry a widow. Now, even though as the commentaries point out, neither one of there is a pogum, because a widow is not a pogum and a kohen gadol is not a pogum, but the relationship is a pogum. It's not allowed. Or grusha v'chalutza, a kohen hedjot, or a divorcee to a regular kohen, or mamzeres or nesina Yisrael, or mamzeres or nesina to a regular Yisrael, or bas Yisrael or mamzer, or nasin, or as a regular Jewish girl to a mamzer or nasin. Then in all of those cases, we're going to say that the Vlad the offspring is going to be considered defective. And Rashi tells us, Achar pogum shebeshneim. So meaning to say, if somebody is born, Rashi says, Shenolmi psuli kahuna havlad pasal. If somebody is born from the psuli kahuna, the offspring is disqualified. V'chein ben mamzeres Yisrael. If you have the son of a mamzeres to a regular Yisrael, or a mom is going to be considered a mamzer. And also the son of a mamzer from a Yisraelis is going to be a mamzer. So that's what Rashi has told us. And now we go to the third case of our Mishnah. What's the third case of our Mishnah? The third case is the Kol Mi She'ein La Alav Kiddushin, any case where their Kiddushin would not take effect at all. Aval Yesh La Ala Cherem Kiddushin, means that the Kiddushin won't take effect between these two people, but there would be Kiddushin with another person. Then we're going to say Havlad Mamzer. And in those cases, the offspring is going to be considered a mamzer. Means to say she can't marry you, but she can marry somebody else. So then under those circumstances, the offspring is going to be considered a mamzer. And what's the example of that? That's if somebody has a relationship with one of the prohibited arayos, one of the prohibited relationships from the Torah. And the Gemara and the Mishnah tells us the example. And the Mishnah doesn't need to tell us the example. The Rashi tells us this is somebody who's chayav kares with. So somebody who has a relationship with one of the people they're prohibited to marry, and so therefore they could be married to somebody else, but not to you. So then we're going to say that under those circumstances, the offspring is a mamzer. And then the last case of the Mishnah, the fourth case of the Mishnah, is Kol mi she'ein lo love v'lo acherem Kiddushin. Let's say the person cannot marry, the person doesn't have a Kiddushin, not with you, not with anybody else. Then Avlad Kamosa. Then the offspring is going to be like that person. And what's the example of this? Rashi says, that Vlad Shifcha v'Nachris. This is the offspring of a slave girl or a Nachris or a somebody who's not Jewish. So therefore, under those circumstances, then the offspring is going to be considered like the mother in that case, or like the and that's the halacha. Look at Rashi. Avlad Kamosa. Vlad Nachris, the offspring of a Jewish woman, of a non-Jewish woman, is not Jewish. And if she would convert, then then it would be kosher. Vlad Shifcha, this is Rashi says the reference to a slave whose owners have freed him. He's going to be kosher, and he can marry he's permitted to marry a Jew. If there was a slave and then his master freed him, he's not like a mamzer. He can at that point marry a regular Jew. So now we go up to the Gemara that says, the Gemara, Kol Makom Sheyesh Kiddushin. What does the first case of our Mishnah say? The first case of our Mishnah says any place where there is Kiddushin and there's not a sin, the offspring is going to go following the male. So if there's a Kiddushin and there's no sin, generally speaking, we follow the father. So Amrulei Rabbi, so Kol Makom Sheyesh Kiddushin. Amrulei Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yochanan Kulalahu. He asked the question: is this a general rule? Is this really the case? To call Makom Sheyesh Kiddushin ve'ina vera Vlad holech achar. Is it really the case that any place where there's Kiddushin and there's no sin, the offspring follows after the male? Hare ger. What about the fact that there is a convert? Shenasim mamzeris. Let's say there's a convert. We're on top of now Samal Zayin Amud Aleph. Let's say you have a convert who marries a mamzeres. The Yesh Kiddushin, that there is a case where the Kiddushin does take effect. The Ein Avera, and there is no, and it's not prohibited. Rashi says right away that this is following the position of Rabbi Yossi, who says that the converts are called kahal, that gerim are not called the kahal, and therefore they're allowed to marry into a mamzer, because mamzer says lo yavo mamzer b'kahal Hashem, so the converts are not called the kahal, and so therefore there's no sin according to Rabbi Yossi for the ger to marry a convert. And so therefore, what about the fact that there's a ger shenas mamzeres, the yesh kedushin be'ein avera, and there we say avlad holech achar pogum, and there we don't say that the offspring follows the father, we say that there the offspring follows the pogum, the defective one. In that case, the offspring will be a mamzer. The Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, ger shenas mamzeres avlad mamzer. If the convert marries a mamzeres, the offspring is a mamzer. So why would Divrei Rabbi Yossi? So why would we say that anytime you have a Kiddushin Tovsin and it is not prohibited, that the offspring follows the father, when we know that in this case it follows the pogum? So the Gemara says, Amrulei Nisavris Masnisin Rabbi Yossi. Why would you assume that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi? Our Mishnah is not Rabbi Yossi. Masnisin Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah is following the position of Rabbi Yehuda, who says Ger lo yisa mamzeres, who says that a convert is not allowed to marry a mamzeres, and so therefore our Mishnah is following the position of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that a ger cannot marry a mamzeres. So we have to say from here, we have to remember this, that the first cause of our Mishnah follows the position of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the ger is not prohibited to marry the mamzeres, and so therefore that's the first part. But so then the Gemara says, but anytime, we said in the second clause, anytime that there's Kiddushin and there is a sin, then it follows after the pogum. V'yesh Kiddushin v'yesh avera avlad holech achar pogum. And so therefore, that's why this case of the ger marrying the mamzeres is not listed in the first case, because it's a sin. The Gemara says v'nesnaya. So why isn't this case listed in the second category where it says v'yesh avera Yesh Kiddushin Yesh Avera Vlado Achar Pogum, and it gives us the example of the Amana to the Kohen Gadol. Why doesn't it list the case of the Ger and the Mamzeris? According to you, this case should be listed. So the Gemara answers, Tana Kol Makom, Tana Kol Makom. The Seifa Lasuye. So that's why in the second case in the Mishnah, it says Kol Makom, anytime that there's a sin and there's Kiddushin, then the Vlad goes after the Pogum, and that's including this case of the Ger to the Mamzeris. So that's the first answer. So that it is listed. It's listed when it says Kol Makom. So the Gemara says, Ibaya Seima, or alternative answer, Lolam Rabbi Yossi. Alternatively, we could say that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi, who says that a ger is allowed to marry a mamzeres and it's not a mitzvah. And so if that's the case, why do we say it follows after the pogrom in this case, even though Rabbi Yossi says it doesn't? Why wouldn't this case be listed in the first case of Rabbi Yossi? Because this is another example of that it should follow after the father. Why didn't it list it? But here in this case, it goes after the mamzeres. If it's Rabbi Yossi, why does it break the rule? So the Gemara says, because Vitana Ezezu Lumiyute, because when it says Ezezu, the next clause in the Mishnah, it's excluding this case. Even though in general the offspring goes after the father if there's no sin, this is an exception. So the Gemara Tana, so therefore Vitana Ezezu Lumiyute. Gemara says so is this the only case where there's Kiddushin and it's not a sin and it doesn't follow after the father? But we have another case. What about the case of a chol? A chol is somebody whose father was a Kohen and he married somebody he wasn't allowed to. Let's say, for example, he married a divorcee. That the offspring of such a situation is the daughter of is considered to be Chol Shanas Abbas Yisrael, that we're going to say under those circumstances that we say that the Rashi says we learned that. So we're just going to wait for the airplane to cross. What? It's our airplanes, yeah. It's as the president of the United States said, it's on our team. So we have a Chol. That Bas Chalol is the daughter of a Chol is Bas Chalol Zachar Psul Kahuna. That the daughter of a Chalol Zachar is disqualified to the Kahuna, meaning to say that the offspring of Chalol is not allowed to marry a Kohen. So we see Alma Achar Zachar who Mikre Chalol, even we call him after the Zachar. So back to the case. So is this Ve'ezazu? Is this excluding the only case where it's permitted and the Kiddushin doesn't follow the father? What about the case of a Chol? Shanas Abbas Yisrael. You have a regular Chalol will marry the daughter of a Israelite. The Yesh Kiddushin. There we say the Kiddushin takes effect. The Ein Avera, and it's not a sin. And Avlad Holech Achar Zachar. And yet, nevertheless, we're going to say that the offspring follows after the male and is going to be considered a chol in that case. So the Gemara says, and that's not going to be difficult. Halo kasha, that's not a good difficulty. Kirabi dostai ben Yehuda svirle. No, because this is our Mishnah is following the position of Rabbi Yehudai, Rabbi Dostai ben Yehudai, who's of the position, who says that Benot Yisrael mikvah tahara l'chalal, and Rashi says that the daughters of Israel they purify the chalal, and therefore her daughter is allowed to marry a Kohen. And unlike our Mishnah, who says that it disqualifies you. So it's not like that assumption of our Mishnah, and so therefore that's not a case. Gemara says, well, what about the next case? Varei Yisrael shenasa chalal. Let's say you have a regular Jew who marries the daughter of a chalal. Yesh Kiddushin, that there is Kiddushin, ve'ein avera, and it's not a sin. Havad holech achar zachar, but we say that the offspring is going to be considered a chol and it's not going to be able to marry a kohen there. Look at Rashi. Harei Yisrael shenas chalal, the Yesh Kiddushin ve'ein avera, lo asura el kohanim. That we're saying under this case that this woman who married the daughter of the kohen, she's only prohibited. The daughter of the kohen. So she's a chalola, she's only prohibited to marry Kohanim. And yet we're going to say that the offspring follows the Zachar. The Tanala Kaman, we learn later on, Bitok Sheryl Kahuna, his daughter is kosher to marry a Kohen. And we don't say she's a chalala, kipagam shebeshneim. We don't say she's a chalala. So we're going to say that his daughter can marry a Kohen. So what do we say about that?
That's the general rules that are halal can't marry Kohen. That's enough coming out between the Chalala and Israel.
Well, we're saying here that according to this position, the chalala, the daughter of the chalala, can marry the Kohen.
I'm saying the Chalala herself. That's her nafkamina between the Israeli. Is the fact of marrying a Kohen? That's
Well, no, we're saying here that she can marry it.
The daughter.
It's by Yisrael shenasa chalala. Oh, the chalala herself can. That's what we're saying here, according to this position. But the daughter can. But then we have a principle which we saw earlier that any person who the daughter can marry, the mother-in-law can marry, and so that's why they say that it doesn't apply. We'll see that. So various Rosh Hashanah, the H Kiddushin ve'ina ve'rav vlad holech achar zachar, and it's going to be considered a zachar who can marry a Kohen. So the Gemara says Tana kol makom dereisho asuye. Okay, so therefore it lists the kol makom. When it says kol makom in the first clause, is to include this case where it follows the male because it's not prohibited, and even though it wasn't listed. The Gemara says v'nisnaya ba'adei. So why wasn't it listed? Why don't you list this case also amongst the cases where it follows after the Kohen? The Gemara says, well, the reason why we don't list it is Mishum Delo Ma'asnila, because it would have been awkward for the Mishnah to list it. Heichi Nisne, where could they have learned it? Where could it have said it? It doesn't fit within the easy flow of the Mishnah. How would we have listed it? Kohenes Levius V'Yisraelis. Excuse me, v'chalala shenisis lekohen. What did it give an example of a kohenes, a Levi, and Israelis, and a chalala that married a kohen, or a Levi v'Yisrael v'chalala kohen? Michazio, can a Levi, or can a Levi and Israel and a chalala, can they even marry a kohen? So they wouldn't be able to marry, and so therefore, since this case wouldn't have been able to be easily listed. Therefore, they didn't list it in the Mishnah. Well, just I'll read the Rashi here. Why didn't they list it in the Mishnah? Gabe Kohenes Levi Israelis. Why didn't they list it in the Mishnah when the Mishnah lists examples of the Kohenes Levi Israelis? And the Gemara answers Mishani. The Gemara answers Mishum Delom Masnula. Because the Mishnah wasn't convenient for to list it. Because the Tana couldn't have listed it with the others in an abbreviated language. The name of Ezu Kohanas Levi Yisraelis v'Chalala, because how could it say what is the example of a Kohanas Levi Yisraelis and a Chalala shenasu a Kohen Levi Yisrael who married a Kohen Levi Yisrael? The mashma Chalala nami a Kohen ain't there, which would have implied that the Chalala can marry the Kohen without it being a sin. So the Gemara gives another question. Va'ika de Rav Bar Chana. Why don't we list the case of Rav Bar Chana? The Amri, Rav Bar Chana said, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. What about the case of a Mitri Sheni, of a second generation Egyptian? We know that Torah says you're not allowed to marry Egyptian until the third generation, or there's a dispute in the Gemara. What exactly that means, the Gemara in Yevamos, but it says as a baseline that a Mitzri Sheni Shenatza Mitzris Rishona, that if you have a male Egyptian who marries a female Egyptian, that the Bana is a Shlishi, and that's a permitted marriage, and the offspring is a third generation Egyptian, which you can marry in. And so therefore, why don't we list that amongst the cases which are considered that it follows after the male? Gemara says, Tana kol makom dereisho asuye. So when it says kol makom in the first clause, it's including this case of the male Egyptian that marries the female Egyptian. Well, that's why it should have been listed in the first case, because there's no Avera here. So why didn't it list it amongst the examples of the first case where the offspring follows the male in a case where there's no Avera? And that's why they're asking, why don't they list it there? Gemara says, Rav Dimi da Amar Sheni Aviyam, according to Rav Dimi, who says in Yevamos that even if you have the male offspring who of the second generation Egyptian who marries the first generation female, that it's going to be considered a second generation, meaning it's saying it follows the female. According to Rav Dimi, Sheni Ave. So then, if that's the case, then this breaks the rule. It breaks the first clause of the Mishnah's rule. So the Gemara says, yeah, according to Rav Dimi, we have to say Tana Ezuzul Miyute, that's what it's excluding. Gemara says we have another example. Va'ika, we have the next case. T'chiyasa Rav and Amar Rabbi Yochanan. V'umos holach achar azacher. That when it comes to the nations of the world, if their lineage, we follow the male. Niskairo, but once they convert, holach achar pagam sheveshneim. And once they convert, we follow the pagam, the defective one amongst them. Like we're going to see, Gemara is going to teach us exactly what that's referring to. And so, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says amongst the nations we follow the males, but once they convert, we follow the pagam shebishneim. So there in that case, Tana Ezizu Mute Hai. That it's the Ezizu is excluding that case. So the Gemara says, what is that case? What is that case which Rabbi Yochanan is referring to? That Rabban says in Rabbi Yochanan, my So then the Gemara is first going to ask another question. Now, if you want to say, according to the first case, that our Mishnah is, excuse me, there was a Kelev here, and the Kelev wants to study Gemara with me. So the Kelev was nuzzling up a very, very good Kelev wants to study with me. So if you want to say our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, like we said above, who said that the ger is not allowed to marry the mamzeris, then kol makom dereisha, then the first clause, when it says kol makom in the first clause, it's coming to include a Yisrael shenatzach haloah. It's coming to include the case of a regular Jew who marries a haloah, and we're going to say it follows the male, and he's not, and the offspring is permitted to marry a Kohen, with the Rabbi Baruch and Ezazu. And when it says Ezazu, that's when you take the Rav Dimi v'Ravin, is to exclude the case that Rav Dimi taught and Ravin taught, which is Rav Dimi said that the offspring of the Egyptian, the male, and Egyptian and the female is going to follow the female. And Ravin, who said that by Umos we follow the male, but once then they convert, we follow the pagam. And Kol Makom the Seifa. And when it says the Kol Makom, or on Tavas Samach Sayin on Beis, when it says Kol Makom in the next clause, it comes to include Lasuye Ger Shenat Mamzeres. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that's permitted. It's coming to include the male that marries the Mamzeres. Eliyah Rabbi Yossi. But if you say it's Rabbi Yossi who says that a Ger is, remember we said that if we said that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi, who says that if a ger marries a mamzeres, then the offspring is a mamzer, because he's going to say that the kahal gerim is not called a kahal. So if you say our Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi, kol makom dereisha keda'amran, then we're going to say that the first clause of the reisha is, like we said, is to include a Jew who marries a chalolah, that the offspring is not a chalal. And Elakol Makom the safe, according to Rabbi Yossi, what's it coming to include? So Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda. So that's the question. What's Rabbi Yossi saying the Kol Makom on the safe is coming to include? And Gemara's response is, according to your logic, Rabbi Yehuda, Ezizu the safe Lamale. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, he has to explain what's being limited by the case of the safe when it says Ezizu. So therefore, the Gemara says, and there's a common answer the Gemara gives in general, I did Tane Reisha Ezizu, Tane Seifa Ezizu. According to both approaches, you have to say that Ezizu is not always exact, that it's coming to limit. It's just they're making the Mishnah symmetrical. And Achinami, I've done a Reisha Kol Makom, Tane Nami Seifa Kol Makom. So now the Gemara goes back to saying, let's analyze a statement that was recorded in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Kiyasa Rabin Amar Rabbi Yochanan, this statement of Rabbi Yochanan, Be'umos halach achar zachar, that by the nations of the world we follow the male for lineage, but Niskaira, but once they convert, holach achar pagam shemeshneim, we follow the pagam, the defective one amongst them. What's the example of this? My be'umos halach achar zachar. What does it mean by the nations of the world we follow the male? It means kedetanya, like the following brisa. So this is also something that you should remember from Yevamos. It says, how do we know that if there's one amongst the nations of the world, Shabal Kananis, let's say there's just somebody from amongst the nations of the world, meaning to say that he's not from the Umos of Eretz Yisrael. He's not one of the 7 nations who you're obligated under the verse of Vosachaya Kol Neshama. He's wasn't one of the 7 nations who you were commanded, who the Israelites were commanded not to allow to live, but he was somebody who was allowed to live. and he had a relationship with the Canaanist, who was included within the category of Osachaya Kol Neshama. And so they had this relationship. So the male is allowed to live, the female is not, and they had this relationship, and they gave birth to a son. So how do we know that you're allowed to acquire him and as a slave, and you're not obligated to kill him? So it says that you're allowed. So that pasuk is coming to include this category. I might think also. Let's say you have one of the Evet Kanani, a male Canaanite who was with a female who was not from the 7 nations. So I might think in that case also that you're allowed to acquire him. Meaning to say that's another case where we don't follow the in that case we don't follow the in that case, we follow the male, and so therefore, you're not allowed to allow that offspring to live. So that's the proof that by the Nachrim we follow after the father. So then the Gemara says, Niskaira, what about Rabbi Yochanan's statement that once that they convert, we follow after the pogrom that amongst them? But what's this referring to? If you want to say this refers to a Mitzri Shenasa Monis, that you have a male Egyptian who you're not allowed to marry until the 3rd generation, and refers to a female Ammonite who you are allowed to marry, my pogomika. Then there's no pogrom, meaning to say that you're allowed to marry. Why is this considered to be a pogrom? Look at the Rashi. My pogomika b'tzada'im. What does it mean? That obviously we're saying that by the female there's a pogrom, and that's why it says you follow the pogrom. Otherwise you would follow the male. But there's no pogrom by an Ammonis woman. You're allowed to marry her. Ammoni v'lo Ammonis. You're allowed to marry a female Ammonite, and not a male. So it must be that we're talking about an Ammoni shenasa mitris. We're talking about a male Ammonite who married an Egyptian. And the Egyptian visa, so meaning to say, and this is what we're going to say, the male Ammonite you're not allowed to marry, and the female Egyptian you can only marry in the 3rd generation. If you give birth to a male from the Ammonite and the female Egyptian, Shaja Basre, we're going to say he's an Ammonite, you can't marry him. And in the Keva, if it's a female, Shaja Basra Dida, then we follow the Egyptian, and she still can't marry until the 3rd generation. Kol she'en lo alav Kiddushin. So now we go to the the 3rd case of our Mishnah, which says any case in which there is, what did it say in the Mishnah? Any case where it's not a Kiddushin with him, but there's a Kiddushin with others, and the offspring is a mamzer. So the Gemara says, Manani Mili. How do we know this case that if you don't have Kiddushin with her, but she has Kiddushin with somebody else, the offspring is a mamzer? It's based upon the pasuk Amar Kra, the Yatzami base, so that it says in the verse, it says she goes out from the house, and she goes and she marries somebody else. That with other people it's a kedushin v'lo lekrovim, but not with those erevos, not with the relatives. So Maskefla Rabbi Abba ve'ima la'acher v'lo ben. Maybe it means that with other people it's a kedushin, but not with her husband's son. What does it mean, v'lo ben? Here she says, ben bala. Maybe it's only excluding her husband's son. So the Gemara says, no, that's not what's excluding, because ben bala, that's written explicitly. Lo yikach ishes aviv. That a man is not allowed to take the wife of his father. So if that's the case, so why, according to that approach, why does it say the ish acher? It's to teach us this idea that she can't, that the kedushin is not toe-faced with relatives. The Gemara says maybe both psukim are teaching us that it's not kedushin with the son. And one is tell us that she can't marry her husband's son, and b'di'evet it doesn't take effect. Where it says no, we already know she can't marry her husband's son, because we learned it out me'achos isha nafka. We learned that by making kal v'chomer from you're not allowed to marry the sister of your wife. Ma'achos isha, just like the sister of your wife, bekares lo tikdash, just like the sister of your wife, that there's a prohibition of kares and the kedusha doesn't take effect. Chayve misus bezdin lo kol shkein, for sure in the case of where the punishment is death by the court, for sure it doesn't take effect. Mara says, maybe they're both by your wife's sister. And Mara says, okay, you're right. In achinami. You're right. This pasuk is telling us that you can't marry your wife's sister. If that's the case, Ashkan Achos Isha Shara Rayos. We know. And okay, we know that you can't. That the kedushin doesn't take effect with your wife's sister. How do we know it doesn't take effect with anything else? Where it says Yalfinon Me'achos Isha. We learn out from your wife's sister. Ma'achos Isha Miuchades. Just like your wife's sister is special. Shehi Erva. That it's a prohibition. V'chayaven Alzdona Kares. And you're responsible for the punishment for kares. Well, and accidentally for chatas lo tavsibo kedushin, and the kedushin doesn't take effect. Of course, she erva, anything that's an erva chayaven al sedona kares al shigas chatas. You're liable for kares and accidentally for chatas lo tavsibo kedushin. The kedushin won't take effect. Gemara says bishlam makulu asyan. I understand all of them. Ela ashes is for ashes ach. Fine, it works by all the ervas except for your brother's wife and your and Ashes, except for married women and your brother's wife, because Iko and Mifrach, because we could ask that those cases are separate. Malachos Isha, Shekain Ein Laheter Ben Makom Mitzvah, your wife's sister, there's no case where it's a mitzvah to marry her. Toma Ba'ashes Ach, but your brother's wife, sometimes it's a mitzvah. Sheish Laheter Ben Makom Mitzvah. And Ashes Ish, and also married woman, Namiko Mifrach. You could also ask a question. She's never, the others are never prohibited while she's alive. Tomar Ba'ishes Ish, she Ish Laheter B'chaya, but she can become permitted with when she's divorced. B'chaya also with the one who prohibits her. So therefore, so we're going to learn out the fact that the Kiddushin, and in any case where the Kiddushin doesn't take effect with her, the offspring of such a union would be a mamzer. We learn out from the pasuk Kol Asher Yaseh Mikol it says anybody will do for any one of these abominations. We're going to compare all the arayos to your sister, your wife's sister. So just like your wife, just like all the arayos, just like your wife's sister, that if you try to marry her, the Kiddushin doesn't take effect. Also, all the arayos, if you try to marry them, the Kiddushin doesn't take effect. So the Gemara is going to go on with this in Samachas, but for now we'll stop here. Thank you for watching it on the YouTube. A big shkoyach to Elio for studying with me. And Am Yisrael Chai, and we should have Yeshua, Tzala, Nachama for all of Klal Yisrael. Amen, amen.